Welcome back to News All Day. Thanks so much for staying with us as we take a look at the U.S. District Court in Lower Manhattan as we continue to follow the latest in the criminal trial of Sean Diddy Combs happening there. The defense presents its closing arguments today, and prosecutors completed their closings yesterday, describing Combs as the leader of a criminal enterprise who used money, power, and influence to get away with his alleged crimes. Combs has pleaded not guilty to charges that include racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking. If convicted on all counts, he could face up to life in prison. Joining me now to talk more about this is criminal defense attorney and former Manhattan prosecutor Jeremy Saland. Jeremy, before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of the case here, can we just take a step back, explain to our viewers what got us here? What is Diddy exactly being accused of?
Yeah, so that first charge is the RICO, or the conspiracy to commit this racketeering, which basically says, as you pointed out, there's a criminal enterprise. He's at the top of it. There's the same criminal purpose and intent. And when the prosecution needs to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, they need to establish that there was pattern acts or these pattern crimes underneath it. For example, kidnapping, arson, drugs, obstruction, other elements and other offenses that are part of this overall reaching conspiracy that he was involved with other people to commit these acts.
Now, has the prosecution made a strong case here? Have they effectively linked these allegations to a criminal enterprise? It seems like some legal experts believe there is actually a lot of room for the jury to find reasonable doubt here.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest charge. There still is a sex trafficking and the transportation for the purposes of prostitution. But this RICO charge, which is potentially life in prison for him, they need to get out, who was he a co-conspirator with? You didn't hear from anybody else who was a co-conspirator, although there was allegations, for example, as chief of staff. Or for that matter, was this really a criminal enterprise when in fact this is a legitimate business of music mogul, clothing, alcohol, among other things? And what were these underlying criminal pattern acts that were underneath this that establish this overarching scheme that he was committed in? So it's a difficult lift, I think, for that particular charge, though the other ones may be quote unquote easier to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
And as we, are in closing arguments now, of course, the last chance for both sides to make that argument, hopefully a lasting argument with the jury. Anything that stands out to you from closings?
Yeah, well, I'll start sort of in reverse. The defense had already come on, or in the process now. They made some sarcastic comments about making America safe from Astroglide. And one interesting comment, which in part is good, meaning it was a right approach. The defense is conceding domestic violence, and they're conceding that he's a bad guy, and you may not like him. We're owning that. But at the same time, Mark Agnifilo, defense counsel, referred to the relationship with Cassie as sort of a modern love story. Well, those are kind of opposite. They don't really work together. But the defense has to say this was a consensual act, or multiple consensual acts. This was not trafficking. There's not forced coercion or anything like that. Whereas the prosecution is saying, even if Cassie consented at one point in time, even if this other Jane person consented, you can consent at time one and not consent at other times. And proof of these underlying criminal acts that build up this enterprise were, for example, Chris Cuddy's car, which was firebombed allegedly, the kidnapping allegations of holding Cassie against her will. So these are the things that they're going to. It's going to be, I think, an uphill battle for that first charge, as I mentioned before. But to a certain extent, the prosecution has a relative easy one with the transportation for prostitution because it doesn't require force or coercion, just that they're coming across state lines and engaging in prostitution.
Of course, we don't know what is going to happen once the jury has the case in its hands, but considering what you have seen in the case, what do you expect? Do you think it'll be a long deliberation, a quick one?
Well, you've had a multi-week trial and these hour-long summations. I think the jury is really going to have I'll use the term difficulty, that may not be the right word, but they're really going to have to do their due diligence for that top count of the conspiracy for RICO. It's a big lift to say this really should have just been, pardon me, could have been a state domestic violence case. They didn't go that route, and that's the angle that the defense is saying. But is it really this criminal enterprise? I do think, though, again, that transportation for prostitution is a much easier lift that the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That sex trafficking is somewhere in the middle. I hate to hedge my bets, but I'm not in that jury room.
Yeah, okay, Jeremy, thank you so much.
My pleasure.